It began not with a scream, but with a sound. On the morning of September 15th, 1916, a strange cacophony filled the skies over the French countryside. The rhythmic churn of gears, the hiss of steam, the metallic rattle of plated steel grinding over mud. A new weapon had arrived. It looked more like a barn on tracks than anything resembling a machine of war. But as it crawled forward, its thick armor absorbing bullets like rain on stone, one thing was clear. The battlefield would never be the same again. This was the debut of the tank, a direct descendant of coal, steam, and human ambition. But this story begins far earlier. For decades before that first armored beast groaned across no man's land, something deeper had been transforming the nature of warfare. It wasn't a new general. It wasn't a brilliant tactic. It was industry. And like all revolutions, it began quietly. Yet the consequences would be deafening. The Industrial Revolution was never meant to create war machines. It was meant to build wealth, liberate labor, and light cities. But like many of humanity's greatest advancements, it bore a darker twin one forged in soot, steel, and blood. By the early 18th century, British engineers had harnessed the power of steam. What began as a solution for pumping water from mines became a force that powered factories, trains, and entire empires. As coal fed the engines of progress, it also laid the tracks for a different kind of conquest, one measured not in miles or profits, but in casualties. The logic of mass production, repeatable, scalable, precise, soon found its way into the logic of war. Muskets, once crafted by hand, were now produced by the thousands in arsenals, from Springfield to Liège. Rifles became more accurate. Artillery became more mobile. The battlefield, once defined by its chaos and unpredictability, was being ordered, quantified, industrialized. By the mid-19th century, the first true glimpses of industrial warfare began to emerge. In Crimea, British and French soldiers faced Russian defenders in a bloody conflict over influence in the Black Sea. Yet beyond the diplomatic wrangling and military maneuvers, a quiet revolution was underway. Steam-powered warships dominated the seas. Explosive shells, newly designed and terrifyingly effective, tore through wooden hulls with ease. In Sevastopol, modern artillery created scenes that would foreshadow the horrors to come. Trenches dug hastily into the earth, bodies shattered by ordnance far beyond human scale. But Crimea was just the overture. The American Civil War from 1861 to 1865 would become the proving ground of industrialized death. Rifles with rifled barrels, breech-loading mechanisms, and metallic cartridges turned open fields into killing zones. In the span of mere hours, thousands perished at battles like Antietam and Gettysburg, where technology outpaced tactics. Railroads ferried troops faster than ever before. Telegraphs flashed orders across entire theaters of war. Factories churned out uniforms, rifles, and rations in quantities no pre-industrial army could have imagined. When General William Tecumseh Sherman marched his troops across Georgia, destroying infrastructure and civilian property alike, he was not just waging war, he was practicing total war. It was a phrase that had barely entered the military lexicon, but its time had come. By the 1870s, Europe had taken notice. Prussia, the industrial powerhouse of the German-speaking world, had used railroads with surgical precision during its wars of unification. In 1870, it mobilized over 450,000 soldiers in just 18 days to invade France. It wasn't just manpower, it was machines, rifles, shells, food, uniforms a nation made mobile by metal and steam. This logistical feat was not just a testament to planning, it was a declaration. The nation that controls the factories controls the battlefield. It was this realization that gave birth to the modern military-industrial complex. And yet, few truly understood what that meant. War was still imagined in romantic terms: cavalry charges, gallant officers, clear victories. The reality was becoming something far more grim. Artillery, once a blunt instrument, was evolving. Steel breech-loaded cannons allowed for faster rates of fire, greater accuracy, and easier mobility. The Prussian victory over France in 1871 owed as much to these innovations as to any general's maneuver. At the same time, the deadly power of industrial warfare was being tested not just in Europe, but in Europe's colonies. In Africa and Asia, empires deployed machine guns and modern artillery against indigenous forces armed with spears and swords. The results were lopsided and horrifying. At Omdurman in 1898, British forces under Lord Kitchener used Maxim machine guns to mow down over 10,000 modest warriors in a single day. The lesson was brutally clear. He who commands industry commands victory. But there was another lesson, one no one was willing to confront. What happens when both sides possess the same machines? The dawn of the 20th century found Europe standing on a powder keg, and every great power was holding a match. Beneath the grandeur of uniforms and the rituals of diplomacy, the continent had become a network of steel railways, hidden mobilization timetables, and production quotas. Alliances were written not just in treaties, but in tons of coal and kilograms of TNT. The military planners of the era believed that efficiency, industrial, logistical, and bureaucratic would bring victory swiftly. They were wrong. In fact, the very nature of industry would become their undoing. When Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated on June 28, 1914, it triggered a chain reaction not unlike a shell in a munitions factory. Unstable, precise, and impossible to stop. Mobilization orders were issued with cold mechanical regularity. Within weeks, Europe had lurched into a war. None of its leaders fully understood a war shaped not by glory or honor, but by tonnage, horsepower, and the range of a field gun. Germany's Schlieffen Plan, designed to crush France quickly before turning east toward Russia, relied on industrial logic, precise timing, massive logistics, and uninterrupted rail transport. But the war it unleashed would not be quick, and it would not be clean. From the very first campaigns, the battlefield itself revolted against old assumptions. In Belgium and northern France, defenders dug into the earth with steel and sweat. Machine guns stitched death across open fields. Artillery transformed entire villages into smoking craters. Trench warfare was born not by design, but by necessity. Soon, the Western Front ossified into a wound that spanned from the Alps to the English Channel, a vast system of dugouts, barbed wire, and misery. Commanders, many still trained in the cavalry doctrine of the previous century, responded with repetition. They ordered wave after wave of infantry, over the top, into a firestorm of bullets and shells. At the Battle of the Somme in 1916, the British Army suffered nearly 60,000 casualties on the first day alone. Why? Because the logic of industrial war is unforgiving. A machine gun does not tire. It does not hesitate. It does not miss when properly aimed. And for the first time in human history, there were tens of thousands of them fed by factories working around the clock. Industry, once the handmaiden of progress, had become the Grim Reaper's most efficient servant. Still, the killing continued. And yet, despite the horror, innovation surged forward with relentless speed. Planes, barely more than fabric and wire, buzzed above the trenches. At first, they served only to scout. Then, they began dropping bombs. Then came aerial duels, machine guns mounted to propellers, and eventually strategic bombing campaigns. But even the skies could not break the stalemate. So the generals turned to the earth. In a factory in Chilwell, England, engineers worked in secrecy. They were building something new, something absurd, something desperate. It had no precedent, no elegant form. It moved like a wounded animal, belching smoke and fumes. But it had armor, it had guns, and, most importantly, it could cross trenches. They called it the landship, but history would remember it by a different name. On September 15th, 1916, the British unleashed their new weapon at the Battle of Flers-Courcelette, the tank. The results were mixed. Many broke down. Some became stuck in mud. Others simply failed to start. But those that moved changed everything. For the first time in 2 years, troops advanced behind steel, protected from small arms and barbed wire. It was a glimpse of the future. one obscured by soot and oil. The French would soon follow, developing their own models lighter, faster, better suited to mass production. Germany, lacking the resources, lagged behind. And that more than any tactical error would become decisive. Because by 1917, the war was not being won by generals. It was being won or lost by factory managers. Every shell fired, every uniform sewn, every rifle shipped to the front. It all came from a civilian workforce that had become as vital as any battalion. And no state understood this better than the United States. When America entered the war in April 1917, it brought more than soldiers. It brought production. Vast reserves of steel, coal, and oil were turned toward the war effort. Shipyards launched vessels at unprecedented rates. Railroads carried goods across a continent with industrial discipline. And by 1918, more than 2 million American soldiers had crossed the Atlantic, equipped, supplied, and determined. Germany, blockaded and exhausted, could not match it. By the fall of 1918, the German Empire, one of the most powerful and industrialized nations on Earth, collapsed not on the battlefield, but on the factory floor. Its rail lines were fractured. Its people were starving. Its munitions depots were empty. The Kaiser abdicated. An armistice was signed, and the war, the most devastating in human history up to that point, came to an end. But the machines did not stop. The First World War was not just a conflict of nations. It was a crucible that melted the old world and forged a new one in steel, soot, and silence. What emerged from the trenches of Europe was not peace, but something more permanent, a redefinition of what war meant. Before 1914, warfare had always relied to some degree on heroism, improvisation, and human skill. Now, those things were subordinated to horsepower, industrial output, and the steady pulse of machine labor. Men still fought. But it was machines that determined if they lived or died. The war had exposed a brutal arithmetic. Victory belonged not to the bravest, but to the side that could build faster, longer, and larger. The body counts were no longer a side effect. They were calculated costs, planned and predicted down to the shell and the shovel. In the aftermath of the war, nations across the globe faced the grim task of rebuilding. Not just cities and economies, but worldviews. Europe had been the birthplace of industrial warfare, and it was now its graveyard. The old empires, Russian, Ottoman, Austro-Hungarian, and German, had collapsed. Their borders redrawn, their societies frayed, their leaders either executed or exiled. But while the European continent burned, the machines kept humming elsewhere. The factories that had been converted to produce shells and tanks were now producing cars, radios, and domestic appliances. The infrastructure of death was repurposed for peace, but the blueprint of war had been permanently rewritten. The lessons of World War I did not fade with the ceasefire. They lingered in military academies, in government archives, in the minds of veterans and visionaries, and they would be studied obsessively. In the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin watched as mass mobilization had turned civilian industry into an engine of dominance. In Germany, humiliated but technologically ambitious, engineers began dreaming of machines that would move faster, hit harder, and fly higher. In the United States, industrialists and generals alike saw in the war a terrifying potential. What if the next conflict was fought not in the trenches, but in the air, or through production quotas? World War I had not made the world safer. It had made it smarter, colder, more mechanized. It had taught nations how to fight forever. The 20s and 30s often remembered for jazz, economic crashes, and the rise of dictators were in fact a period of frantic rearmament, thinly veiled beneath the surface of peace. The League of Nations condemned aggression, even as nations quietly rebuilt their arsenals. Disarmament conferences were held while steel flowed in secret into the hulls of new warships. And the victors of World War I clung to the illusion that trench warfare had been a one-time nightmare, a fluke of history. But the war had changed everything, even the soldier. By 1939, the average infantryman no longer marched in bright uniforms under fluttering flags. He wore steel on his head, carried a semi-automatic weapon, and moved under the cover of tanks and aircraft. He no longer relied on a commander's trumpet, but on radio waves bouncing off the atmosphere. And the wars that followed in Ethiopia, in Spain, in China, all echoed the rhythms first beaten into history during the Great War. Factories were again refitted. Assembly lines converted from tractors to tanks. Civilians once considered bystanders were now strategic assets or targets. It was clear. World War I had not been the end of something. It had been the beginning. There is a cruel poetry to the fact that machines which once promised liberation from labor and toil became the very instruments that redefined human suffering. The same gears that powered textile mills and railroads were now powering howitzers and submarines. And in that shift, something fundamental was lost. In the mud of the Somme, in the gas clouds of Ypres, in the burnt-out skeletons of Verdun, human life was not simply taken, it was calculated away. This was no longer the war of kings or causes. It was the war of quotas, efficiency reports, and mechanized attrition. The factory, once the beating heart of progress, had become a temple of sacrifice. And yet, amid the devastation, a question remained unanswered. Had humanity mastered its machines? Or had the machines begun to master humanity? Even after the guns fell silent on November 11th, 1918, the machines did not stop. The lathe kept spinning. The furnaces kept burning. And across the world, the blueprints of the First World War were quietly studied, revised, perfected. In the interwar years, no one could ignore what had happened. It had taken less than 5 years for the industrial age to produce over 20 million deaths. No previous conflict, not even the Napoleonic Wars or the Mongol conquests, had killed with such speed and scale. And this horror had been man-made, deliberate, refined. Still, the world did not turn away from the machines of war. It embraced them. Germany, under Adolf Hitler, did not merely rearm it, reimagined war itself. The lessons of trench stagnation were inverted. New doctrines like Blitzkrieg lightning war were built on speed, surprise, and synchronized machinery. Tanks moved in formation with aircraft. Radio communications allowed for real-time coordination. Armored columns were no longer isolated experiments. They were the spearhead of empire. And this time, they worked. In 1939, Poland fell in weeks. In 1940, France collapsed in 6. The Wehrmacht had achieved what seemed impossible. It had made industrial war fast. But speed brought new horrors. Cities bombed into oblivion. Populations rounded up with bureaucratic efficiency. Entire industries dedicated not just to warfare but to extermination. Auschwitz had a commandant and a supply chain. World War II became the final, full expression of what the First World War had begun, a conflict where production lines determined battle lines and where the fate of millions rested on the yield of a factory. And once again, it ended, not with heroism, but with industry. In August 1945, a single American bomber, loaded with a device built by the world's most advanced scientists, dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima. In seconds, a city was gone. 3 days later, Nagasaki followed. 2 explosions ended the deadliest war in history, but they also signaled the beginning of something far more terrifying. The Cold War that followed was not just a standoff of ideologies. It was a standoff of industries. The arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union was not decided by battles. It was decided by budgets, patents, and production quotas. Nuclear arsenals were measured in megatons. Missiles were cataloged by range and payload. Entire nations were reshaped around the demands of military research and industrial supremacy. Wars continued in Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, but the logic remained. Whoever produced more, faster, and smarter won. And even when the Cold War ended, the machine did not stop. Today, The drone replaces the pilot, the satellite replaces the scout, and the algorithm replaces the analyst. Industry has moved into the digital realm, but its effect remains the same. In Ukraine, precision-guided artillery, satellite surveillance, and drone swarms have redefined what it means to hold ground. And yet the old truths persist. It is the nation with the greater capacity to build, adapt, and sustain that holds the upper hand. War has become sterile, yet more lethal than ever. Commanders may sit in bunkers or boardrooms, but the factories humming in silence still decide the outcome. There is a haunting idea whispered in the footnotes of history that once humanity builds a machine, it cannot be unbuilt. It can only be repurposed or replaced. The factories of the First World War produced more than shells and shrapnel. They produced a paradigm, one that redefined violence, restructured society, and reshaped the relationship between man and machine. For over a century, we have lived in the shadow of those assembly lines. The weapons change, the names change, but the logic remains. Today, as we develop artificial intelligence, hypersonic missiles, and autonomous combat systems, the question grows louder. Have we learned from the past? Or are we simply upgrading it? In the end, the story of industrial war is not one of generals or treaties. It is the story of gears and ghosts, of steel melted into power and men turned into numbers. And unless we confront the true cost of progress, we may soon find that the machines we built were never really under our control at all. Thank you for watching Legacy Files. If this story moved you, challenged you, or made you see the past in a new light, please consider subscribing for more deep, cinematic histories. Because sometimes, the only way to understand our future is to confront the full weight of our past.